Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Rob Larson, professor of economics at Tacoma Community College, author of Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sam. My pleasure.
Let's just start with, like you do in your book, with the sheer numbers. But also, I want to compare it to where we've been in the past, because I know, according to Thomas Piketty, we are the idea of some type of wealth equality, like the Great Compression that we had in the post-war era, is the exception to the rule. But where are we relative to, say, like the Gilded Age? Like, how bad is the wealth inequality, and how much money do our wealthy overlords have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the very short version of that is we've gone a long part of the way back to the Gilded Age. We haven't quite achieved the completely deranged numbers of that era. And of course, numbers from that era are a little spotty. It's before regular record keeping, of course. But thanks to the work of a lot of economists, not least Dr. Piketty, who you mentioned, we have some pretty good visibility on this now. So going with the US, for example, if we look at that just as a starting point, that classic wealthiest 1% of households, right now, the newest data that we have is those richest 1% of households owning 35% of the national wealth. Of course, that's a wealth rather than income. Wealth is always more concentrated than income, but that's pretty strong numbers. And if we look at, for example, other parts of the distribution, such as the bottom 50%, which is how Piketty frequently breaks out the ratios, we find that their share of the national wealth is about 1.5% compared to almost a third of the national wealth owned by that top 1%, which is completely bananas for wealth levels. But the Gilded Age, to the extent we have numbers, was a little bit crazier. The UK, for example, where we have better data from that era, we have numbers where that wealthiest 1% owned half the country, almost 50% of the wealth. So we've taken a lot of steps back toward the Gilded Age, thanks to the tax relief programs, primarily from the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations. So that Great Compression, as you referred to, is definitely in the rearview mirror. Incidentally, the numbers I rely on in the book for these questions of the numerical concentration of all this money, I mostly get it from the WID. That's the World Inequality Database. People should definitely take a look at their website. It's really fun, great data visualization. They have a separate page for almost every country in the world. Piketty is one of the economists who's in that consortium, but pretty ugly numbers regardless.
Do you have a sense of like the 0.1%? Because it just feels to me like we have, the fractal inequality, we have, it seems to me, more, I don't know what the equivalent would have been during the Gilded Age to the billionaires that we have today, but it seems like we have within that 1% also people who are literally in the stratosphere. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the idea of space as you discussed in your book. But we have people living in the stratosphere, who are so powerful and so fundamentally disconnected from the planet, like humanity, that to me seems beyond where we were with the Gilded Age. Like in the Gilded Age, right? Like you got to take a train, right? There are certain things you have to do that you're literally grounded in ways that now you don't need to be, you don't have the same human constraints, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because, you had people who are definitely as egomaniacal as today's billionaires, but at the same time, and of course, going by purchasing power, the wealth of the big mega millionaires of the Gilded Age, like Rockefeller and Carnegie and the human J.P. Morgan, not the bank. It's comparable in its buying power to today's billionaires. Obviously, we've had inflation and so on since then, so it is comparable. But it is interesting because, after all, those earlier figures, though, it was the early Industrial Revolution. And yeah, as you said, you might have a fancier private train car, but you are still on the train. And it's still an era, before most antibiotics and stuff. So even your incredible oligarchs of that era, and their power was insane, don't get me wrong. But today, technology has come a century and a half further from where it was at that point. And it does affect the lived experience of some of these incredibly powerful oligarchs. And the disconnectedness you mentioned is something I like to talk about a lot. In the lifestyle chapter of the book, just looking at the daily reality for people with this kind of money. The disconnectedness, I think, comes from a couple aspects. I mean, just the first one is, remember, you look at families this wealthy, obviously you own your own home. You don't have a mortgage. You own your home and you own multiple grand homes. But you also have, not just like staff, but like household staff, people who are full-time working for you, cleaning your home, paying your bills, doing your errands. So you lose contact with that basic, going to market, the price of things. Everyone knows, the funny, Lucille Bluth meme. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. You got there first. The Lucille Bluth meme where she's wondering at the price of basic grocery commodities. So there's that piece of it. But the thing I always remind people of too is once you're in a wealth echelon of this level, you're going to have a bunch of people around you, paid or your friends, and they're all going to kiss your ass all the time. Because you're very wealthy and maybe also very powerful, and you don't want to get disinvited to the big yacht vacation or the white party or whatever fun social, heinous ruling class ice cream socials that you're going to. And what it means is everyone around you wants something from you. They tell you you're great. No one tells you you're an idiot. I always just tell my students, just think what that does to your ability to connect to reality. If no one tells you you're stupid for like a year, you will lose contact with reality. It makes sense. And when you look at the decisions these characters make, if you keep that context in mind of the crazy inner circle of ass-kissing sycophants, I think that helps you make sense of what they do sometimes.
Elon Musk, didn't Elon Musk just have a tweet where he put out like, it seemed, sometimes I can't tell what joke it was I don't remember what joke he told, but he said something in the tweet to the effect of like, sometimes the joke you tell around the table with everybody is not as funny as you think it is. And it's because they're all fake laughing at you because you're not funny and they're afraid of offending you in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Musk really is a case unto himself for the just nakedly pitiful, desperate psychology a lot of these members of the ruling class. You can be powerful and still inwardly be just monumentally insecure. Just a fascinating case. People will be discussing his accidental self-revelations, I think, into the future. But that's a great example. Yeah, things don't do so good as they do around the table. Yeah, because we're not your employees and people who count on you for vacation time. That's right. Yeah, we're not cringing people who will say any heinous, like sub dad joke, non-pun is funny. Like that is the distinction there.
But what's interesting to me is how there's almost like another level for maybe the 1 and 10% even in this country of isolation that also I think adds a buffer for these extremely wealthy people. Like if you're in the top 10%, you also are now increasingly probably using services like Uber Eats or DoorDash or things that are your groceries getting delivered to your home, where those tasks are done by somebody who is a low-wage worker, maybe an immigrant who doesn't have documentation fully, or you're likely in suburbia. You're likely in your own little fiefdom in your, $800,000 a year house, or and you're reading true crime, or you're reading or listening to the local news about how dangerous the city that you're 30 to 40 minutes away from is. Like there's that other class beneath the very wealthy that I also think is experiencing a degree of isolation from community that only reinforces that strata above it.
Oh, absolutely. And this is like I mean, that's a major aspect of how these phenomena shake out. I have a little section in one of those chapters about class segregation. And this, unlike classic legally mandated Jim Crow racial segregation, this doesn't require any kind of ugly policy making like that. It just happens through natural market forces. You can't afford a house in the rich gated community enclaves, and just through natural market sorting, blue collar, white collar, and certainly with the wealthier households, they self-segregate whether they like it or not, really, just because of the reality of how these market forces work. So it's definitely something that we are seeing, though, with the the millionaire aspirants, with the white collar or PMC upper part of the middle class, who, as we all know, very commonly see themselves as being on the way to being Jeff Bezos next year. But that segregation, though, is important. And I mentioned this elsewhere in the book. If you look at marketing, pitching products to these wealthiest households, going back to those very wealthy ones, there is no word more commonly used in high-end marketing than exclusive. This is an exclusive resort and an exclusive event, and you'll take your private jet to a private resort where your private chef will serve you food in your private spa. The ability to segregate yourself from other people, and from wall to wall too, and even things we might like to avoid, like the big, crowd trying to board commercial flights. That's half the reason these people say they buy private planes, is so they can segregate themselves further from the unpleasantness of being a regular middle class person. But it's it's a completely decisive phenomenon, that segregation, for sure.
And that purchasing power. I mean, what's interesting is for instance, it will create a fake representation. I mean, you'll hear that the marketplace is democratic in some fashion, but the reality is that the number of people, for instance, who watch CNBC or watch Fox Business News is probably less in any given hour than actually watches this show over the course of 24 hours. I mean, we're just a YouTube show, but they are geared towards a very specific demographic of extremely wealthy people. And so the ad sales that they get there is not a function of the Nielsen ratings or whatever. However, it is a function of, it's okay if we only have 10,000 people, because what we're selling them on any given day is so expensive that the ad rates can afford to be higher. And it creates this sort of twisted notion of what's going on in the world on some level, that these outlets can be supported and be seen on the same sort of news sources and relevance, I guess, as ones that are supported by a much wider audience.
That absolutely is the case. One of the clearest places that you can see the class structure of our society is in our media. And I'm an economist, so I'm obliged to read the Wall Street Journal, which is, a very good newspaper. It's geared towards, investors and executives and, economists and managers and stock analysts and stuff like that. And the Wall Street Journal, is a very high circulation paper. But if you look at business media generally, very commonly, as you said, their audience numbers, it's not Sunday Night Football. It's not huge numbers. But in media, they actually refer to audiences that are wealthier as higher quality. In media, that is the term that's used. It's a very quality market that watches this show. And it's very high-end advertisements. But it's true. That means, though, in the same token, that a lot of this business coverage, which, every struggling small town paper will have a little stock section, or at least talk about recent stock movements. That's a huge part of online media, is catering to business news. It is relevant to a very, very small number of us. In fact, one of the, I think, most important points in my whole goofy book, and just an important thing for people to realize, is just to connect that corporate America and its incredible power of today, which we're all familiar with. We, as you said, we refer to the marketplace as being democratic, but it's one where you have only 2 or 3 options in most markets, just like politically. So maybe it's a good analogy. But if you look at the stocks that represent ownership of these companies, we often refer to corporate America and giant global firms as being unaccountable to the public. And that's true. They're not accountable to us. We cannot control them. If they want to outsource all of our industry after NAFTA's passage, they obviously had the power to do that, even though no American would ever vote for that. But they are accountable to somebody, and that is the ruling class through ownership of their stock, right? If you own shares in Microsoft or Walmart or whatever, you own a tiny piece of the company. So who owns the stock and therefore owns corporate America? Well, we have a little research on this too, not as much as we should, but the most recent data we got, just to kind of connect this, is that the wealthiest, again, 1% of households by wealth own 40% of all corporate stock. The 1% owns almost half of the entire corporate world, and the richest 10% owns 84%, like most of it. Like, that's important. Like, every time we see the incredible profitability of today's corporate empires, that money goes to someone. And if you're a middle-class person like me, and you were lucky enough to have a small retirement fund through your workplace, as I do here on campus, I indirectly own a few shares of mutual funds, which themselves own share in businesses. But less than half of U.S. households now own any stock at all, even those tiny holdings. So we should just realize when you see, that CNBC and other corporate business reporting, it's of relevance to someone. About 1 in 100 people. That is who it is relevant to.
And we should also say that 10% that owns 84%, between that, the delta between that 10% and the 1%, they're passive shareholders, basically paid off by that 1% who are running these corporations in a way that extracts the value out of workers, essentially, and communities. And they get acquiescence from that other, their fellow, the next, 2 through 10% by basically saying, like, your stock value is going up. We've done that because that's how we get paid directly. All our bonuses are tied to those stock values. And the way that we get that by cutting workers and by, in some instances, maybe if I'm like, I make airplanes, I cut some corners that maybe make society pay for the safety there, or whatnot. And that's what's going on there. Tell us about some of the most egregious, from a lifestyle perspective, some of the most egregious things. Because I knew a guy who worked for a billionaire. I remember him sitting down. He goes, he says, I know you think it's disgusting. It's worse. And in terms of, like, no, guy doesn't go through customs. Guy just picks up the phone, calls the president of some university. I didn't like what I read in this newspaper. And the president of the university jumps on the phone with this guy, that type of thing. I've had a conversation with a billionaire who's like, they were expecting a kid, and he didn't even know where they were going to have it. Like, it was more just like they float above the earth, and he knows it's going to happen, and he knows it's going to be the best. He just doesn't have to know the details of, like, where we're having that kid.
Yeah, the level of, like, freedom on that level, just like freedom from daily anxiety that we experience in the working and middle classes all the time. As soon as you get sick in America, it's, or get pregnant, will I be able to manage the medical care associated with this? Will the insurance company that belongs to wealthy people decide to pay my claim? So yeah, that is a big part of their lifestyle, is just this utter freedom that is pretty annoying, frankly, because, we all deserve a significant amount of freedom. I actually wrote a whole book about this years ago, Capitalism versus Freedom. People can take a look at that. But that freedom aspect is really annoying. But as to get to your question, Sam, about the lifestyle stuff, yeah, I have a large chapter on this because it's pretty goofy. There's a lot of stuff we can turn to. Real estate is always one that people want to talk about. 'Cause again, for working class people, like, your whole economic life revolves around your relationship to your primary residence. Can you make rent? Today's stratospheric rents. Landlords have lost their damn minds. Can you afford the rent? Or if you're a little more prosperous, Maybe you spend years saving up for a down payment on a modest home, and then you get a big mortgage that beats you up every month to sustain it, and that's if you're lucky like me and you're able to get one of those things. For the ruling class, it's completely different. So you have very nice homes that you own. They belong to you. You don't borrow money and get mortgages for things. You're rich. You're a creditor, not a debtor. You put money into the financial system that people like us try to borrow a little of to get a car or a house. So that's an important part of it. But the homes themselves are fairly insane. The best source on this, in my opinion, is in the Wall Street Journal. Every Friday, they have what they call the mansion section of the paper. And it's a separate section. They don't put it online, interestingly. It's just in the physical copy. So you have to be paying enough for an expensive Wall Street Journal subscription to see this thing. But it is very revealing. And I mean, there's a lot in the book. I just have a few examples that might be sort of representative. Just a couple months ago, they had a profile of a Hamptons property. And of course, people know the Hamptons, the Long Island kind of vacation area for Wall Street financiers outside New York City. They mentioned they were renovating. One of these families was renovating their giant home, and they had a bill of $30,000 for one room for the curtains. It's just I'm sure it's a very nice window treatment, but $30,000. I mean, that's
for the curtains only.
Yeah, just the curtains, just for the window treatment. I'm sure it's very lovely. But I mean, for most of us, that's like a car and a half. That's like a existential amount of money for like a middle-class person. Another one, they were looking at a very large Los Angeles estate. And this is just quoting them here to give you a flavor of it. They said the estate has 40 rooms, or 60 if you included the servants' quarters and the walk-in silver, fur, and wine vaults in the basement. That's interesting. And you have a lot of stuff related to the real estate too that's kind of fun. Favorite story of mine that's in the book is a recounting of a 1950s socialite up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, of course, where the old money is considered to be in that city. And it mentions, the source I had mentions that this Manhattanite would send her butler back to Long Island, back to the Hamptons every week to dig up soil for her Pekingese peaches to poop on, because she preferred that soil, we're told. This is the kind of thing you can do if you have more money than you will miss if you waste it on things. And it's interesting stuff. I mean, the real estate we can go on with quite a bit. We mentioned somewhere else in the book that a number of more progressive jurisdictions like London and New York City have started requiring property developers, when they put up new residential buildings, they're mostly high end because that's where the most profitable sales are when you have a wealthy ruling class that's this loaded. But these jurisdictions started requiring developers, they required them to start having some affordable units, which are relatively affordable, way below market rate units. But the developers, forced to do this, accepted it, but they realized they didn't want working class people going and mingling with the high end tenants. So if you go into one of these buildings, there's a very beautiful entrance, and there's a doorman and a big glassy lobby with lots of light, and there's a concierge. But if you're living in one of those affordable units, you don't go through that door. Yeah, you go through the other door. And if you look at the photos of these, they're like utilitarian, off-white corridors, ugly fluorescent light. There's cameras and a sign saying, if you destroy property, we're videotaping you. And the term in the real estate industry for these separate entrances is poor doors. So if you live in one of these cities and you have an affordable unit, you will enter through the poor doors. I just remember this some write-up in The Guardian, if I recall correctly, and they were just talking to someone who's just a real estate agent. And she said that the two doors are so that the two social strata don't have to meet. That's the quote. It's like, this is the lifestyle. It's like segregation, and then there's the insane luxury on top of that.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.